fewer Russian tanks on the front line and $4 million gone from Russia's military treasury. Ukrainian defenders shared footage of the destruction of 2 enemy T-72s. The military notes that tanks have become a rarity on the battlefield, and when they spot such a target, FPV drones on fiber optics are sent into the sky. They guarantee a 90% hit rate, since these drones are unaffected by either the radio horizon or Russian electronic warfare systems. And in the Kupiansk direction, drone operators prevent the enemy from moving equipment up to the line of contact, cut off communications by destroying Starlinks and antennas, and have also turned Russian artillery systems and a multiple rocket launcher into scrap metal. Meanwhile, military experts note that Russia has begun actively replenishing the depleted ranks of its army.
Partial mobilization has been announced, as well as the creation of a strategic reserve. This means that they, well, aren't really succeeding. Well, not really. In fact, nothing is working out for them. If you look at their operation, their offensive operation, all three, as President Zelensky said. This year, all three have failed. They haven't achieved any strategic advantage anywhere.
Since the beginning of the day, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has recorded 83 battles along the entire front line. In the Torets direction, the invaders tried 12 times to break through the Ukrainian defenses, but were unsuccessful. The defense forces also repelled 8 enemy attacks each in the Lyman and Novopavlivka sectors of the front. The Russian army did not advance in the Huliapol, Orakhiv, or Pridniprovsk directions. The Russians remain most active in the Pokrovsk direction. Over the course of the day, they attacked Ukrainian positions 32 times.
The enemy will try to prevent their troops from being encircled in this sector of the front, where they are sending reinforcements. There are very intense battles on the ground. At the moment, on the salient, in fact, in my opinion, the fate of all the fighting on the Pokrovsk sector of the front is actually being decided there, where the enemy tried to encircle our troops around Pokrovsk and Berdiangrad.
Russia lost 960 soldiers in the war against Ukraine over the past day, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And the total losses of the Russian army have exceeded 1,102,000 people. Also, over the past day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 1 tank, 1 armored fighting vehicle, as well as an enemy multiple rocket launcher system. In addition, the Russian army lost 47 artillery pieces. The defense forces also destroyed 3 Russian helicopters and more than 400 drones.
Ukraine's defense forces are regaining control over Alexivka in the Sumy region. Ukrainian flags are appearing in different parts of this settlement, according to soldiers from the 225th Separate Assault Battalion. They clarified that the Russian occupiers are unsuccessfully trying to hold their positions, but nothing is working out for them. Ukraine's defense forces are actively eliminating the invaders and taking prisoners, thus replenishing the exchange fund.
The armed forces of Ukraine near Sumy have literally knocked a strategic trump card out of Putin's hands. This was reported by analysts from the New York Times. Supposedly, earlier Moscow had proposed exchanging the captured parts of Sumy region for non-occupied by Russia settlements in Donetsk and Luhansk regions as part of a peace agreement. However, the counteroffensive by the armed forces of Ukraine and the return of even small areas of the region to their control forced the Russian command to abandon this operation. The publication also notes that the successes of the defense forces in the Sumy region help Kiev counter Moscow's narrative that the Ukrainian armed forces are unable to stop the Russian advance. Let's discuss this topic with our guest on air. Joining us is Serhiy Brachuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Serhiy, welcome to the Freedom Broadcast. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory heroes, glory defense forces, greetings colleagues.
Serhiy, so I think we'll generally discuss the situation at the front. But it's very interesting to start this discussion specifically with Sumy. So, if such a trump card is taken out of the Kremlin's hands, what's left? Because there were hopes, or at least according to some information, that the non-occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions could be obtained through this kind of blackmail. At this stage, that's not going to work. Yes, we understand that there are still plenty of Russians whom the Kremlin can throw onto the front lines. But at the same time, since such proposals and bargaining have taken place, it's possible there are certain concerns that the Kremlin's plans regarding Donetsk and Luhansk regions may not work out.
Of course, I have great respect for the New York Times, and the vivid imagination of the authors of this piece. But I want to say that war is not a card game. Ukrainian territories are not playing cards. Maybe for Putin, it is a card game. But Putin's attitude and the way Putin values the lives of Russian soldiers, we won't discuss that today. It's well known. As for our territories, no one is bargaining with Ukrainian land. And obviously, that's not even up for discussion, let alone any so-called peace agreements or peace talks, MMM, which in reality haven't even taken place. But let's move on to the front lines themselves. Indeed, today we're talking about how, in particular, the northern Slobozhansk sector of the front has become, for the enemy, a repeat of the first Kharkiv operation when, let me remind you, last year the enemy also attacked from the direction of Lipsy. Volchansk was stopped, and they were crushed. And despite all their efforts, up to today there hasn't really been any significant progress there.
The only thing is that our cities there, Vovchansk and some other settlements, were completely destroyed by the enemy. But even that didn't lead to any advance toward the regional center, the city of Kharkiv, or in fact, across the territory of Kharkiv region. The same goes for Sumy region today. If not long ago, we used to say that for the Russians, this was like a suitcase without a handle, something they can't throw away, but is very hard to carry. Then today we can probably say that this suitcase, someone else's suitcase, meaning our territory, has actually turned out to be a tough nut to crack, beyond the strength and ability of the Russian aggressor. It's clear that today we are seeing continued fighting in the North Slobozhansky direction. However, for example, the 225th Separate Assault Regiment reports that Ukrainian flags are being raised on our territory. Returning to certain locations, I'd like to remind you, it was specifically in the Sumy region that we managed to drive the enemy out of our territory, beyond the borders of our country, and push them past our state border, which is very important. And of course, the enemy is fighting back. The enemy has not stopped certain offensive actions, for example, in the area of the settlement of Yunikivka. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say this looks like some kind of agony, but that victorious, almost fanatical drive of the Russian troops that they showed at the start of their offensive in the Sumy region, well, today, there's nothing left of that drive.
All that's left is the dust of Russian soldiers dying there for their Russian Führer, who couldn't care less about their lives. The fighting continues. The situation isn't, let's say, particularly rosy today, because this is war and our people are dying. But nevertheless, the main thing has been achieved. We managed to stop the enemy, push them back, and today we are liberating our territories. And, in fact, these efforts by the defense forces and our assault troops, who, I'm sure, have earned the right to become a separate branch of the armed forces of Ukraine, as you know, that decision has already been made and this structure is being formed. Well, we can say that the enemy no longer looks at Sumy region the way they did just a few months ago. And, in fact, those reserves that today have been redeployed, including to the Donetsk front. They were taken from the Sumy region. So it's clear that the situation has turned out badly for the Russians and continues to develop in a way that is not very, desirable for them. But let's not rush, because the operation in the Sumy direction is still ongoing. So thanks to everyone who is working in the Sumy region, including my brothers in arms from the Ukrainian volunteer army units, who are fighting in Sumy as part of the armed forces of Ukraine.
Serhiy, these attempts that are still ongoing from the enemy, despite their failures and the complete collapse of all their plans in the Sumy direction, do you think this is more because, from an informational standpoint, the Kremlin simply can't afford to just pull out of there, even though they've already suffered heavy losses? Or do you think the enemy is still planning to make some serious attempts there?
The question here is whether the Kremlin actually knows, if we're talking about the Moscow Führer, whether he really knows the true situation, specifically what's happening in the Sumy region. Because the entire information environment, I absolutely agree with you on that. And the maps behind their backs, that's already become a running joke. The maps behind the backs of the so-called chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, who, let me remind you, is 70 years old, and whose service in the armed forces of the Russian Federation was just extended for another 5 years. Well, in this case, Putin really pulled it off. He outplayed everyone. Someone has to answer for the failure of the so-called special military operation, and I'm sure that will be Gerasimov, first and foremost, unless he dies before then. Well, honestly, the real lack of understanding of the situation, I think, is what's preventing the Russians from fully withdrawing from the Sumy region today. They are still trying to attack there, as I already mentioned, but as for having the resources to continue such active, intense combat operations, well, that's just not the case anymore. Moreover, we know that reserves have been transferred from the Kursk region to the Donetsk front. That's where the priority is now. That's where another battle for Ukraine is unfolding. And really, when people say that the most decisive battle of this war is about to happen, well, you know, in reality, none of us truly understands, or even more so, knows for sure. It's possible that the main battle for Ukraine has already taken place, and we won it. We came out victorious. And today, the war goes on, the battle continues, and, in particular, the Sumy region is one of the elements of this battle. Nothing is over yet. We need to understand that here as well, and we are fully aware of it. So let's put it this way. There is absolutely no room for complacency among the troops.
Sergey, there's another interesting point. Once again, if you don't mind, I'd like to return specifically to the Sumy direction. After all, the Russian occupiers went in there hoping to expand the front. But now, little by little, the armed forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Defense Forces, are eliminating them. How much does this, overall, disrupt the logistics of the Russian occupiers? How much does it disrupt their plans? Because, as practice shows, wherever the armed forces of Ukraine start to become active, reinforcements from other directions are quickly sent there. Are you seeing this happening now, in general?
Well, let's take a look at Sumy region. And of course, we have to talk about Doberilia today, because the situation there is similar and, in fact, is probably developing even a bit more actively. As for Sumy region, yes, in Sumy region they managed to stop the troops, and they managed to repel them. You know, the Marines were very actively involved there. It's all about the Marines, except they've never actually seen the sea or the ocean, and they've never seen any large landing ships either. But still, they're called Marines, but these are combat-ready units. Today, we can't downplay the ability of our defense forces to conduct not only defensive operations, but also counterattacks. That's why the liberation of our territories. Actually, let's take a look at how much this affects, including the Russian troops. After all, the Kremlin doesn't hide the fact that all these statements about Moscow's willingness to continue this bloody war, Russia against Ukraine, are based on claims like, we have the resources, we're ready to fight practically until 2030, and we're going to do it. So, it's a war of resources, but today it's also a war of logistics. And so, basically, the goal is to stretch the Ukrainian front as much as possible, to exhaust our reserves as much as possible, and to prevent us from being able to transfer those reserves to other directions. In other words, to engage the entire front from Sumy region all the way to Crimea. Today, it's not just Kherson anymore. Crimea has already become an active front as well. After all, you have to agree. That's why the enemy's desire to stretch our reserves, our resources, hasn't gone anywhere. That's why today we see activity along the entire line of combat engagement. It's just that the results for the Russians aren't exactly, let's say, very pleasant everywhere.
And you started talking about Doberilia. I'd like to continue on that topic. Ukrainian defense forces are advancing near Doberilia. The armed forces of Ukraine are moving forward. This was a statement by Alexander Syrsky, and according to him, just in the past day, searches and elimination of Russian occupiers were carried out over an area of more than 2 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk district. As for Doberilia, that was also quite an important point for our enemy, and here too they are suffering setbacks. Is this because most of the forces are currently focused on Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad? Or are there already certain difficulties even in this specific priority direction for the enemy?
And in the past day, we liberated 1,000, or rather, 1,300 square meters of territory. Yes, so that's a pretty good result. You remember, the Russians used to announce it every day if they advanced even 100 meters. Today, we are trying to and are liberating our territories. So, regarding Doberilia, the most important and probably the fundamental thing today is that the Doberilia counteroffensive operation by the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces of Ukraine, is ongoing. Today, there are those successes that Glocka mentioned, and of course, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to repeat the numbers that General Sersky announced. Nevertheless, we're talking about certain trends that have developed in Doberilia. Nothing is finished there yet, but there really is, well, to put it in Ukrainian, not to jinx it, and in Russian, not to tempt fate. So, basically, the defense forces have achieved certain successes. We can see this from the absolute numbers that Glocka Sersky presented today. It's clear that, most likely, the final decision was made during this counteroffensive operation to create Ukraine's assault troops, partly because Azov is operating here. This is their area of responsibility. We can see the results. Assault troops are operating here, separate assault regiments, and we can see the results. The results are obvious today. That's why it's also clear that the Russians have responded to this operation. They've basically gathered all of the Russian Federation's naval infantry here. Among Russian paratroopers, these are two structures that are constantly competing with each other. In Russia, it's always the naval infantry and the airborne troops. So, the paratroopers are saying that thank God the airborne units are being pulled out of Doberilia now, because they're losing combat effectiveness and they're adding more Marines. It's a pity for them, but not for us. That's why I hope that thanks to the efforts of the assault troops of our Azov Corps, we'll be able to destroy as much of the Russian naval infantry as possible. And in this way, the very frontiers of the so-called Russian pseudo-empire are left exposed, from the Pacific Ocean all the way to, including, Kaliningrad today and the Russian-Ukrainian front. So, the situation in Doberilia today is difficult. The enemy is also trying to carry out offensive actions here, just like in the Sumy region. Don't be surprised. They really are offensive actions. One of the most combat-ready armies is there, the 51st Army of the Russian Federation. There's also another highly capable army there. Its units, the 8th Combined Arms Army. In other words, we can see what forces and efforts the Russian Federation is expending today to hold onto this bridgehead. And, well, of course, as always, we compare this map to that famous bunny, the one with the ears and the Russian snout. There's no other way to put it, and the throat. The ears are gone, the throat's been ripped out. But now it's a very crucial moment to finish what was planned. And God grant strength to all our people, so that what we set out to do succeeds.
Also, Serhiy, if we talk directly about Putin's new threats. He's once again started threatening with nuclear weapons, threatening with force again. But the whole world can see this power on the front lines in Ukraine, that the so-called second army in the world, in reality, hasn't been able to achieve its goals in the so-called special military operation, and it's almost the 4th year now. How much of a trump card is this for the world as a whole? Because, as practice has shown, the world needs to be confident that both Putin and his army can be defeated too.
Well, actually, I think the whole world has long since realized that today the Ukrainian army can hold back the enemy, probably with the help of its allies. Of course, this support needs to be more active. But in any case, we are grateful for all the support we've received since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Right now, it would probably be appropriate and fair to say, if only things had been like this back in 2014, I'm more than sure we wouldn't be in this situation today. But that's something we can't change. That's the past. So we're working on the present and the future. And in fact, we see statements, including from our allies, who say they are ready to work with NATO partners, to shoot down aerial targets together. Well, let's also be honest and truthful with each other. Today, Ukraine is doing everything it can to protect NATO countries from Russian aggression, and has been doing so for 4 years now. So, about Putin's threats. The great geostrategist has outplayed himself once again. After all, it's obvious if you just compare a few facts. You remember when Putin, once again threatening with his nuclear club, said that they were pulling out of agreements with the Americans on nuclear deterrence and were practically ready for a new Cold War. After all, not much time has passed, and now he comes out and talks about so-called peace initiatives. Yes, we are a nuclear power, but we stand for peace. But really, there's only one question. And you want to ask, Pena, is it that you don't have money for an arms race, or is it something else? I think the answer to this question is obvious. The economy of the Russian Federation isn't ready, not just for an arms race, not even for a Cold War. And they really ought to consider that if they want to preserve their pseudo-state, the sooner they end this so-called special military operation, the better it will be for them. But the geostrategist has outplayed everyone again. Let's wish him luck.
Serhiy, thank you so much for taking the time to join our broadcast. Serhiy Bratchik was with us, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.